For the last few Mishnayot, we've been discussing the slaughter of animals on Yom Tov. We need to slaughter an animal on Yom Tov because we need to eat and we need fresh meat. And we were discussing questions of animals which had some kind of kedusha and whether we were able, how we were going to deal with those animals on the festival. We ended up with a question of an animal that was too large to carry. It was slaughtered out into the field, and it could only be carried into the town on some kind of carrying pole or a barrow. And the Mishnah advised us actually to chop it up into pieces and to carry it in limb by limb, because we didn't want to behave as if we were carrying out industrial quantity food preparation on the festival. We can prepare what we need to eat, but we can't prepare more than that. And the Mishnah now, picking up the 6th Mishnah in the 3rd chapter of Beytzah, is going to deal with how we divide up an animal on the festival. In other words, an animal which is too big to eat. Well, how are we going to divide it up between different households? And the principle that the Mishnah is going to follow is that we're going to behave as friends and neighbors and partners, but we're not going to behave in a transactional form. We're not going to behave as traders. That's how the Mishnah begins. Ein nimnin al habehima lechatchila b'yom tov. We don't put people down as partners, or we don't allot partnerships over animals on the festival, on Yom Tov. Aval, but nimnim alehem erev Yom Tov v'shochtzim u'mchalkim beinehem. But we put people down for portions on the eve of Yom Tov, the day before Yom Tov, and then we can slaughter the animal and we can divide it up between them. So in other words, the business of who owns which part of the animal we deal with before the festival begins. And in the same vein, Rabbi Yehuda is going to say, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, shokel adam basar keneged hakli or keneged hakofetz. Rabbi Yehuda is going to say a person can weigh meat against a utensil or against a butcher's cleaver. Now, what does he mean by weighing meat against something? Well, let's recall what the scales looked like in the time of the Mishnah. They didn't have electronic scales now where you could just put a piece of meat on and press a button and get a weight. They would have these scales would have 2 arms. We'd have standardized weights in one arm, and we would have the meat in the other arm. So we'd weigh the meats, we'd weigh the meat against the scales. And when Rabbi Yehuda says, shokel adam basar keneged hakli, we'd weigh meat against the utensil, or keneged hakopetz, that's against the butcher's cleaver. He's saying, look, you wouldn't put a standardized set of weights on the other side of the scales on Yom Tov, but you could put down some heavy object if you knew approximately what it weighed. Like maybe you put a heavy cooking pot, or maybe you put a heavy knife on the other side of the scales. So you'd weigh, but not in the normal way. And the sage will object. V'chachamim omrim. The sages say, Ein mashkichin b'chaf moznaim kol ikar. The sages say we don't pay any attention to the scales, or actually to the palm of the scales at all, i.e., this is Yom Tov. Maybe you can estimate the weight of a piece of meat by picking it up, but absolutely we are not going to put the meat onto the scales, even if we have something on the other side of the scales that's not like a standardized weight. And along the same lines, actually, the Mishnah is going to say, Ein mashchizin et haksakin b'yom tov aval masi'in al gabei chevrata. We're not even going to sharpen a knife on a festival, at least sharpen it in the usual way. We're not going to sharpen it against a whetstone. But we're going to draw it over its partner. What's its partner? We're going to draw it over another knife. So we might sharpen one knife against another knife. We're not going to sharpen it against a whetstone. And similarly, going back to the question of weighing out meat, lo yomar adam la tabach shkoli b'dinar basar. A person shouldn't say to a butcher, weigh me out a dinar's worth of meat. Aval shochet umchalkim benihem. But he may slaughter and they share between them. So the butcher can slaughter and he can divide up with a customer, and they can have an understanding that maybe after Yom Tov, the customer will come in and settle up the cost as to what they've divided between them. But on Yom Tov itself, we're not going to carry out the measurement and the accounting. That is work for a weekday. It's not work for Yom Tov. And along the same lines, Omer Adam L'Chavero, a person can say to his fellow, Maleli Chlizeh avalov mida. He can say, fill this vessel up for me, but not to a specific measure. In other words, you could go round to your neighbor with a cup measure it could be a cup measure or a cup, and you could say, look, fill it up, please, with oil for me, if you want to get some olive oil from your neighbor. But you wouldn't say, fill me a cup, fill me 500 milliliters, fill me a cup of oil. That is referring to the measure. You wouldn't refer to the measure on Yom Tov because that's business. We're not behaving as if we're trading on Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda is going to come back. Rabbi Yehuda is actually saying, look, if it was a cup measure, he can't fill it. You couldn't even fill it on Yom Tov. And the Mishnah is going to bring a story to back up this approach. Ma'aseh Abba Shaul ben Bavnit. There's a story about Abba Shaul ben Bavnit. He used to fill up all his measures on the eve of Yom Tov. So this is clearly an oil or a wine dealer. He'd fill up his measures on the eve of Yom Tov, the day before Yom Tov. V'notnan la lakochot b'Yom Tov, and he'd give them to his customers on Yom Tov. Abba Shaul is a different Abba Shaul, right? Abba Shaul Omer, af b'moed oseh chen. Abba Shaul said he used to do so even on the moed. I think this means during Chol HaMoed. He even used to do this on Chol HaMoed. And there's a story in the Gemara that he used to do this actually to save himself time because he was busy in the Beit Midrash on Chol HaMoed. So he would kind of sort out all his measurements beforehand. V'chachamim omrim af b'chol oseh chen mipnei mitzui hamidot. Although the sages say he used to do so on an ordering day for the sake of draining the measures. In other words, maybe the oil or the liquid he's measuring out has got some froth or some stuff on the top. By pouring out the measures the night before, he knows he's got an accurate quantity when the customer comes in the next day, because he can see that the froth has settled. And a person can go to a shopkeeper to whom he generally goes. This is his regular shopkeeper. He can say, give me a certain number of eggs and nuts. And this is not considered commercial. It's not considered as if he goes in and says, give me a dinar's worth of meat or a certain weight of meat. Because this is the way of a household to reckon in his own home. Everyone in their own home says, look, give me an egg, or give me a couple of eggs, or give me a few nuts. Because this is the normal way that we talk when we're at home. And the general principle that we're following here is that on Yom Tov, we're going to behave like we do in our home or like we do between friends. We're not going to behave as we do in business.